Hi everyone, today we will be covering the GI, renal, and reproductive system in Lab 5. So let's start with GI, and we'll start with the esophagus. The esophagus essentially is this muscular tube that's going to connect your oral cavity, your mouth, to your stomach. It lies posterior to your tracheae, so behind, and anterior to the spine and front. And it has two sphincters. It has an upper and a lower sphincter. And the upper essentially is a barrier between your mouth and the esophagus, and the lower one prevents the backflow of food from your stomach, which can often have acid in it, and that can cause inflammation in your esophagus. Now, if we move further down, we come to the stomach, and our stomach is responsible for three types of digestion. We have mechanical, chemical, and enzymatic. So, mechanical is the physical churning of food, whereas chemical is breaking down the protein structure using the acid, like HCl. And then we also have enzymatic, which is using enzymes to further break down the food particle. You want to note that the stomach is a highly acidic structure, and so it has this mucus lining that essentially provides protection from that acidity. And it's a very important barrier. And when we take away this barrier, it can lead to ulcers in the stomach, which are essentially holes in the stomach. Certain drugs like NSAIDs can cause damage to this barrier. And so there are different structures within the stomach. We have the fundus, which is kind of this upper curvature over here, the body, the middle region, and then we have something called rugal folds, which are essentially these ridges inside the stomach, and these allow the stomach to stretch. We also have the pyloric sphincter, which is right here. And it does something similar to the ones we talked about before, and essentially going to separate two structures. So here it's the stomach and the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. And then we have something called the greater omptinum. It's essentially this apron-like structure that is composed of fatty material, and it's essentially going to, hang from the greater curvature. So from right here, it just kind of looks like an apron hanging off of it. Then we have the small intestine. And so in the first part of the small intestine, we essentially have absorption of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins as well. I should add on to here. And we have, similar to the stomach, three types of digestion, which we already spoke about. And the enzymes are going to be provided by the pancreas, and they're called pancreatic enzymes. The second part is going to be absorption of mainly just nutrients and water. And the second part also has something called brush border enzymes, and they're important for carbohydrate absorption. And for the last part, it's very similar to the second part of the small intestine. Now, in the large intestine, which can be broken to different parts, cecum, colon, and the colon can be split up into four different parts, and then we have the rectum and the anus. And this is essentially the order the food is going to travel in the last part of our GI system. The function of the large intestine is essentially now to compact and store waste, and it's going to reabsorb any remaining waters and vitamins. And there's no digestion that really occurs in this part of the GI. So all the breaking down of the food has already happened before it comes to the large intestine. We also have something called accessory organs, you can say, for our GI. So one of them is the liver, and it's located in the upper right quadrant of the abdomen, and it's going to filter blood, like we talked about previously. It's going to detoxify certain chemicals, also metabolize drugs, and it also produces a bile. And that bile is going to be stored in the gallbladder, so right underneath it. And so bile produced from the liver is stored here, and it will be transported to the small intestine, that first part, via something called the common bile duct. And bile helps us absorb fat. Then we have the pancreas, which is also inferior to the liver, so just underneath. And the pancreas has two main functions, which we talked about at the last lecture, exocrine and endocrine. So, exocrine is those pancreatic enzymes, or some people like to refer to as pancreatic juice because the enzymes have been combined with the bile, and that mixture will be released into the duodenum, and it's going to aid in absorption. We also have endocrine function in the pancreas, which is going to secrete insulin, glucagon, which control blood sugar levels in our blood. And we have our spleen, which is on the opposite side of the liver, so it's in the upper left quadrant, and it's superior to the stomach. It has an important role in recycling red blood cells. It also houses our white blood cells, and when we're having an immune response, those are where our white blood cells come from. Well, some of them. And now moving to the renal system, which we talked about quite a bit at the last lecture. We have our cortex, which is the outer portion, medulla, middle portion, and in the medulla we have our pyramid-like structures, which are also hold our nephrons, and they help create a concentration gradient. And then we have our hilum, which is similar to the hilum of the lung. It's essentially the entrance and exit of structures. Here we're going to have the ureter, the renal artery, and the vein. And then we have something called the pelvis, which comes before the hilum, so this structure right over here. And this is where all the urine is dumped into from the major calyx. And remember the pathway, it's the pyramid to the minor calyx to the major calyx to the pelvis, out the hilum. Flow of urine is from ureter, urinary bladder, and urethra. So ureter is a muscular tube that essentially uses contractions and gravity to bring the urine to the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder, which is this muscular structure, is essentially going to hold the urine until it's ready to release. The urine will travel down the urinary bladder, down the urethra, out the body. And a reminder, it is different for males and females, and you can refer to the lecture notes on that. And now going into the reproductive system here, for males, they have something called erectile tissue, which is going to help in an erection. So they have their corpus spongiosum, which is essentially going to prevent compression of the urethra during erection, and it's essentially located right underneath what we call the corpus cavernosum. The composition is very similar. It's spongy-like material, and it's going to aid in erection. And then we have our testes, which is where we're going to be forming and transporting essentially our male gametes or sperm cells. So we have the first part, the epidermis, which is going to be the storage and transport of these male gametes. They travel to what we call the ductus deferens or the vas deferens, which will transport these sperm cells from the epidermis to the ejaculatory duct until we're ready for ejaculation. And we're going to have some fluid secreted into the sperm cells, essentially. So we have the seminal gland, which is going to secrete fluid in the ejaculatory duct that are alkaline, and that's going to essentially help neutralize the acidic environment the sperm are going to be exposed to in the vagina. And then we also have the prostate gland, which is going to secrete fluid that will help nourish and support the sperm. Enlargement of the prostate gland, which happens as you get older often, can cause constriction of the urethra. So that's an important problem to remember. Scrotum is essentially the sac the testes sit in, and they're just smooth muscle that hold the testes. Moving to females, we have the labia majora. So this is external. It's essentially these two folds of skin that cover the vagina, and their major role is to protect sensitive structures underneath. And then we have the vagina itself, which is going to connect the uterus to the outside environment, and it plays an important role in things like intercourse, menstruation, and childbirth. And similar to males who have testes, females have what we call ovaries, and these are our reproductive organs, and they're going to hold the female gametes. They're called oocytes, or sometimes referred to as eggs, and they're essentially located medial and inferior to the uterine tubes by a very small gap. Important thing to note is that females are born with all their gametes, where males produce gametes in the beginning of puberty. Now, there's something that can happen, and it's called ectopic pregnancy. And essentially, it's when pregnancy doesn't happen where it's supposed to happen, which is the uterus, this highly muscular structure. And that's what we call it ectopic pregnancy. And it can be very, very dangerous and sometimes even deadly if not treated. So it can happen in what we call the uterine tubes or the fallopian tube and other regions as well. And in very, very rare cases, it can travel through the circulatory system and implant in the walls of the liver or the large and small intestines as well. But this is very, very rare. Usually it is in the uterine tube or the fallopian tube. It just doesn't get far enough down to the ureter or the uterus, sorry. And then we have two special ligaments that essentially stabilize our ovaries and also our uterus. So the suspensory ligament attaches the ovaries to the lateral pelvic wall and the uterus, and the round ligament is going to attach the uterus to the anterior pelvic wall. So they're just stabilizing structures. Now we talked about the uterine tubes, which are also called the fallopian tubes, and they are going to carry the gamete all the way to the uterus where it'll either implant or just pass through and menstruation will begin. The uterine tubes have something called fimbriae, which are essentially these finger-like projections, and they're going to grab the gamete once the ovary releases. Remember, the ovary and the fallopian tube are not directly attached, and there's a small little gap in between. So those finger-like projections are really important to make sure they capture the egg and bring it down to the uterus. And as we already spoken about, the uterus is this muscular structure where the egg potentially will implant, and if it doesn't, the uterus essentially will shed and start the cycle all over again. And it's located superior to the bladder, so it's above the bladder. And then we have the cervix, and this is inferior to the uterus and superior to the vagina, and it will dilate during childbirth. Dilate essentially means it will open up, it will stretch. And it has a protective role as well. So it plays an important role in preventing bacteria from coming in and invading the uterus, which can cause infections, inflammation, and things like that, and travel even further up to higher upper respiratory structures. And that is about it for Lab 5. If you guys have any questions, feel free to just shoot me an email. And yeah, that's all. Thank you.